Well, good morning. We're going to go in a little different direction today. I had really planned on doing another lesson on depression, and I was just telling Victor I did not like what I had put together. I felt there was too many pieces missing of the puzzle. So with that in mind, I can assure you that when Victor and I have a chance to put another lesson together, we will have that done for you. But having said that, this Sunday I'm going to be teaching from Romans 15:13, and it's going to be Hop, Skip, and Hope Part 2. And I gotten so much feedback on my last message on that I was really pleased about it, and I'm glad I'm going to be able to do a second part of it. And I would just encourage you to invite your family or friends and people that you know that are just struggling with different issues of their life, that they would watch and interact with it. That would be just terrific. But I was going through my devotions this morning, and I came across an article, again, by Randy Alcorn. You must think that's the only person I know in the whole world. Well, that's not true, but Randy is so good at hitting where we are as a society today. And I want to read to you an article that he wrote. Actually, it was today. It's called "Outrage is Not a Fruit of the Spirit." And I thought, I don't watch news very much. I try to stay away from it for a lot of different reasons. Number one, I don't like to get caught up in all the bickering back and forth. Number two, probably 90% of what you listen to isn't true anyway. And then number three, is it edifying to me? And here's the truth. Whatever you put in your mind will end up being displayed in your behavior. So just think about that. Now, that doesn't mean I don't watch the news. I do, but I'm very selective about what I watch, and I'm very selective about how much time I give to it. And God convicted me of that a few weeks ago about cluttering my mind with satanic lies and demonic influences that are occurring in our world today and in the United States. I will say this. We're not in a political fight, ladies and gentlemen. We're in a spiritual fight for the soul of our country. And all you have to do is just look at what's occurring in our country. Look at the words that are being expressed, the attitude towards one another. In fact, I was thinking about it this morning. I was sitting there and I thought, this is not the country I grew up in. I grew up on a farm in west central Wisconsin. We never locked the doors to our house. We'd go to town, we never locked the doors to our car. You could leave things in a car and nobody ever bothered to steal anything from you. Neighbors got along. In fact, growing up on a farm, we as neighbors every Sunday after church would get together and have a big potluck, and us kids would go out in the field and play softball and just be careful where you stepped. But other than that, we used to have a great time. It was just so totally different. And I look at what's happening to our people, and it's sad. It just breaks my heart, but I know it breaks God's heart even more. And I know that it's so easy to get caught up in what's occurring. And I find people that are depressed over it. They're lethargic, they've given up, they don't see any hope for the future. And I understand, it's easy to fall into that. I understand that. But we have a God of hope. God is in control of our world. He's in control of our nation. He's in control of our leaders, even though we may not like what we see. But listen, if you study the history of Israel, God allowed a lot of wicked rulers to take control and lead and rule over Israel. Why? Because of their sin and disobedience to God. So we as God's people have to set a different standard, I feel, and it starts here. And I think that's what Randy's going to be getting at today. And I'm just, I've never taught like this in my entire life, but I watch John Ortberg just about every day. He's one of my favorite people. He's got a podcast, Becoming New. You can find it on YouTube or some of the other channels. I know Denise watches it, and He is so good. He reads a lot of quotes from people who are terrific thinkers. And I think Randy just happens to be one of those people. Anyway, the article's entitled Outrage is Not a Fruit of the Spirit. So if you just bear with me and let me read this for you today. He writes, in today's digital world, and especially in an election year, it's heartbreaking to see God's people become a bickering, angry mob. And then in parentheses, if you don't believe me, spend a few minutes reading comments on YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter. We are not called to be a herd of online bullies, rushing to judgment and egging each other on to defame our brothers and sisters, some of whom may well be more faithful and honorable in God's sight than we are. I happen to have a good friend of mine up in Longview, Washington, and he posted something yesterday. He just said this on his Facebook page, wow, oh why, exclamation point. Wow, the feedback he got from there. And there were two guys that got on there right away, opposing viewpoints. And it was just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I read just a few of the comments, and one was challenging the other, and the other one said, no, I don't want to get into debate over this thing. And the other one just kept egging him on, well, come on now, you made a comment, I think we ought to have this conversation that's going on. I got off of there, but I think that's what Randy is getting at here, about egging on, and in fact, in some cases, I think it's bullying by the kind of verbiage that we use, and we direct our conversations to one another. So you just might want to think about that. He writes, we desperately need the Lord to do a transforming work in all of our hearts and lives. For God's glory, our good, and the good of a desperate world that needs to know Jesus, let's stop relentlessly and sniping at each other and become in actual thought and practice what He went to the cross to make us, His pure and spotless bride. Just as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself for it, that He might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, and that He might present her to Himself a glorious church, not giving or not having spot or wrinkle or such thing, but that she should be holy, and without blemish. Two important verbs there, Ephesians 5:25 through 27. He continues, we are far too quick to believe reports we hear, and so eager to engage, imagining that we are standing up for Jesus when our actions are based on falsehood. And it goes back to what I said earlier. There's very little truth being presented. So if you're feeding your mind with a lot of untruth, that's just demonic. That's a demonic activity that's going on. We gang up like cowards, imagining that if we punch hard enough and yell loud enough, we have been courageous. And I have seen that happen in Christian circles, unfortunately. Outrage appears to now to be the core of some Christians. Righteous indignation is something appropriate. In other words, when it involves the killing of children or false doctrine promoted at the expense of the gospel. But when outrage and anger becomes our default, we lose all credibility. And in my opinion, he writes, become poor ambassadors for Christ. And when our outrage is against Christ's followers who are doing the right thing, I believe it is particularly hurtful and repugnant to God. Jesus clearly taught that we will be held accountable for our behavior. Let me say that again. Jesus clearly taught that we will be held accountable for our behavior. And not only that, we'll be held accountable someday for our words. Think about that. Likewise, another problem killing many churches is where the old, that includes me, he writes, think all the young are too politically liberal, even when they're not. And that the young think the old care more about being conservatives than sold-out followers of Jesus, even when they don't. So each writes off the other, and the young end up leaving biblically solid churches because they feel there's no place for them, and they go to churches where doctrinal heresy is tragically more acceptable. Of course, he puts in parentheses, of course it's not that simplistic, and there are other factors too. So what would happen if each of us did our part to emphasize first and foremost not human figures or political agendas or earthly kingdoms, but our own identities as sons and daughters and citizens of His kingdom? What would happen if we acted as ambassadors of Christ, not ambassadors of political parties and agendas? What would happen if we acted as ambassadors for Christ and not ambassadors of political parties and agenda? We therefore are Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making His appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20. Political tribalism related to various news channels and talk shows encourages people to pick up their verbal borders and hurl them at anyone with opposing viewpoints. We throw stones even at fellow believers who think differently than we do. It was funny, when I was in seminary, which was about ancient ago, it was funny, when I came there, I thought, well, okay, so I'm at Western Conservative Baptist Seminary. It was kind of a sister school of Dallas Theological Seminary where our Pastor Steve attended. And then I taught there a little bit, not very much, but then I went over to Multnomah Biblical Seminary and taught over there. Both schools, fine academic schools at that time. But yet there were so many varying opinions on campus. From what is a deponent verb? Do we even have such a thing in our Greek New Testament, for example? I can remember two language professors, mine happened to be Dr. DeYoung and another professor, they disagreed vehemently over that issue. Or there were theological issues. I can remember sitting in a class one day, and I was shocked when there were a bunch of students behind me who said they disagreed with Billy Graham's approach to evangelism. And you know what the reason was? He invited what they termed as non-Christians up on the platform. Other people of other faiths, like Episcopalians, Catholic, Jewish, I can't remember all the different denominations, but these students, these colleagues of mine who were sitting behind me were just so opposed to his view of evangelism and that he was watering down the gospel because he allowed all these different groups of people up on the platform with him. And I don't remember, it's been so many years ago where that conversation went, but had I been there now, and I might have said it, I don't know. I would have said, well, when you go do your evangelism, and if you have the fruit bearing that Billy Graham has had, then maybe we can have a conversation. But political tribalism related to various news channels and talk shows, people spend way too much time watching news. And then they wonder why they're depressed, why they're low, why they sort of shrug their shoulders and given up. It's no use, it's hopeless out there. I want to run away. I have felt like that sometimes. Just let me out of here, But I know people in our church, good people, love them dearly, but turn the TV off, turn the news programs off. Or better yet, be very selective on what you watch and how much time you devote to it. Remember what I said, what you fill your mind with will affect your behavior. So we end up throwing stones, even at fellow believers who think differently than we do. But what good does this accomplish? Doesn't it just fuel our anger and rob us of perspective and peace? We'll talk about peace on Sunday, by the way. Instead, let us encourage one another and build each other up. 1 Thessalonians 5:11. So here's an assignment I have for you this week. the rest of this week. This is Wednesday, so we're on the hump day right now. How about asking God this question? God, how can I encourage another believer? And that might mean a phone call, it might be sending them a card, it might be inviting them out for lunch, any number of things. But how can I be an encourager to another believer and build them up, especially if that believer doesn't agree with me on certain issues? But politics and everything else aside, let's just have a pleasant conversation and talk civilly with each other. Encourage one another and build each other up. I have to want to talk a little bit about that word encourage. I remember one day, I was always wondering why I preached the way I did. I didn't grow up with teaching. I grew up, God called me to preach about that fast after I got saved in 1972. And you got to understand, I'm getting invited to churches all over the place, mostly because of my testimony. When you've got kind of a Paul on the Damascus Road kind of experience, word spread very rapidly in our whole area, many different areas. So I was invited to speak in every kind of group imaginable, Christians, businessmen, churches, civic groups, whatever you want to call it. And I was such a novice, I didn't even know what I was doing. I probably still don't know what I'm doing, but that's another story. But so I just kind of grew up learning to teach myself, and I just followed God's direction for my life. And I always wondered why every time I wanted to preach or teach a lesson, I always wanted to encourage people. And one day I was sitting listening to Dr. Charles Stanley. This was quite a few years ago. And I remember he said, I have the gift of preaching prophecy. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Because I'd always thought, well, if you're teaching prophecy, you're foretelling an event that's going to happen. He said, no, he said, that's not what that passage necessarily means. It can mean that. But most often in the New Testament, the word prophetic teaching or prophecy means edifying or encouraging somebody. He said, my preaching that I've been given from God is to encourage or to edify the believers in the church. Bingo, it went off in my head. That's why I feel the way I do about preparing messages. All these almost 54 years, because I've always been that way. Because I used to feel kind of a little bit guilty about it, And then I realized that was my giftedness, was to be an encouragement. In fact, I used to tell people that my biggest joy in life was not that I was up on the platform. In fact, I'm an introvert, believe it or not. And to this day, I'm not very comfortable up in front of people. I like to be behind the scenes, but I like to encourage people when I can. I want to build them up. I want to help them become all that God wants them to be. That's kind of where my giftedness lies. The gift, the spiritual gift that God has given me is the gift of encouragement. I'll say it that way. So you may not have the gift of encouragement necessarily, but we're still called here in this passage, let us encourage one another and build each other up. So that applies to all of us, okay? 1 Thessalonians 5:11. So in conclusion, Randy writes, don't get me wrong, there is a time and place to discuss political issues and candidates, particularly as we evaluate them against the standard of God's unchanging word. But if we would walk away from online disputes and pour the same amount of time and energy into helping those around us, God would be honored, and we and those we help would be happier. Chances are real and positive change might actually result. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that reading today, and let's just all work together as encouraging and building each other up. Thank you, and next time I'll have a lesson on depression. God bless you, and we hope to see you on Sunday. Goodbye.